Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mosaic's first of two webinars regarding the legal needs of human trafficking survivors. I'm Zoe Root, the lead attorney on the Mosaics Initiative, which is dedicated to providing training and technical assistance to court practitioners on how to best identify and assist survivors of sex and labor trafficking who are facing criminal charges. Mosaics is a project of the School of Public Affairs at American University, and it's funded by a grant from the Office for Victims of Crime. In our training and technical assistance, Mosaics works to help court stakeholders better meet the needs of trafficking survivors through an understanding of trauma and applying trauma responsivity and harm reduction in their court settings. Equally important to understanding the social and treatment service needs of survivors is understanding their many potential legal needs. So when Megan Lundstrom of the Avery Center and Marianna Kosharovsky of ALIGHT approached us about doing this two-part webinar series, we jumped at the chance. Marianna Kosharovsky is the founder and executive director of ALIGHT. ALIGHT exists to connect, empower, and build the international anti-trafficking community to more efficiently represent the rights of trafficking victims and survivors. Megan Lundstrom is a member of Mosaic's Training and Advisory Board and the co-founder and director of research at the Avery Center. The Avery Center for Research and Services is dedicated to economic empowerment of survivors of domestic sex trafficking and specializes in programming and advocacy in rural areas. Because of the unique dynamics of human trafficking, survivors of trafficking often defy the eligibility criteria for traditional victim services. As a result, survivors often fall through the cracks and are denied the services they so urgently need. In this, part one of the Legal Needs Workshop Series, Megan and Marianna discussed the findings of the Legal Deserts Report and what it reveals about the landscape of legal services available to human trafficking survivors. Megan and Marianna are here today to discuss specific case studies of how the lack of services harms individual survivors, as well as opportunities for legal professionals to shift the tide and provide meaningful assistance to survivors. Before we get started, I'll go through a few technical points about the format of this webinar, as we are notably not on Zoom, and the format might be a little unfamiliar to folks. So on the right side of your screen, you should be able to see a control panel that has everything you need. Of note, you will see that there is a chat box, which you can use at any time to pose questions either to me and Steve Collins, who is taking care of all the technical aspects of this webinar, if you're having any difficulty. In addition, you can use the chat box to chat a question to Marianna or Megan. I will be keeping track of those questions for our panelists, and at the end, provided that there's enough time, I will pose the questions you put in the chat box to Megan and Marianna so that they can have the opportunity to answer your questions. In addition, on the handouts tab, you will be able to find a copy of the Legal Deserts Report, as well as 3 other handouts provided by our panelists. Finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded. So before we get started, we'd like to administer 2 poll questions to get a sense of who is in the virtual room with us. So Steve, can you go ahead and put those that first poll question up? You'll also be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen, in that control panel, there's a tab called Polls, and you can go ahead and answer the first poll question, which is, have you encountered human trafficking survivors with legal needs? And your options are to select yes, no, or I don't know. Steve, I am not able to see if folks are answering the question. I don't know if other people are.
Yep, we're getting some responses in. Maybe 10 more seconds and close the poll.
Great.
All right, just a few more seconds. Any last minute poll? I'm going to close it right now.
All right. So 83% of you have encountered human trafficking survivors with legal needs. 11% of you have not, and 7% of you say you don't know. Great. So we will move on to the second poll question, which is, of those of you who previously answered yes, so that means those of you who answered no or I don't know, please don't answer this poll question. Were you able to meet those legal needs? So again, your options are yes, no, or I don't know. And again, please don't answer the question if you previously answered no or I don't know.
Give you guys about 20 more seconds and I'll close the poll.
Great.
All right, last chance and closing the poll right about now.
All right. So of those of you who previously answered yes, 46% of you were able to meet the legal needs of the survivors you were working with. 41% of you were not, and 14% of you don't know if you were able to meet their legal needs. Well, this is a great jumping off point to hand it over to Megan and Marianna to talk about the legal needs of survivors of human trafficking.
Hello, everyone. I will start our slide deck now. Are you able to see? Great. Well, the issue of legal obstacles facing human trafficking survivors has been the core of the collaboration of Megan and myself over the past number of years. We are so delighted to welcome you to this workshop and to see this great interest in this issue. I'll close the camera for my speaking portion, but you'll hear from both of us during this presentation. Megan and I remember our first sit-down meeting was in April 2017, and we came together because we were both doing work on the ground with survivors and had a shared concern that survivors were being left out of traditional victim services, and saw how many legal obstacles on their path to recovery were there and how few resources were there for removing those legal obstacles, which of course has impact on a survivor's path forward in terms of their success and their freedom. So we started collaborating with Megan's organization, immediately joining our legal pilot, which was in Denver at the time and has since grown to be a national legal program. And we were connecting the survivors that Megan was working with legal services across a range of issues. We also worked together with Megan providing incredibly valuable insight as we thought about how can we improve the attorney-survivor relationship during legal representation. And you'll see the fruits of that collaboration with a resource towards the end of this presentation called Tips for Attorneys. And eventually, I was very honored to have Megan join the ALIGHT Survivor Advisory Council, where she continues to provide valuable input and guidance.
And I love hearing that story and hearing just both of our perspectives of that. And it's I had to laugh, Marianna, when you remember the month and year, because I remember the conversation, but I did not remember that much detail. As a survivor myself, one of the things that I have experienced quite a bit of, both working in this field, but also initially trying to access services, was a lot of non-survivors I felt like wanted to tell me what I needed and what was best for me. And so I do remember Marianna approaching me and wanting to know my thoughts, and had kind of observed some of these things, that survivors weren't able to access services, even though we're being told that services are available for us. And so right away, that was kind of like a green flag that Marianna likely really truly understood what allyship looked like. And so I remember when she approached me and explained ALIGHT, at the time, I still remember feeling really suspicious, and I did not want to just start sending clients from the Avery Center to ALIGHT without really understanding what it was ALIGHT did and how the process worked. So at the time, I still had arrests on my record. And so I thought, well, I'll go through the ALIGHT process and see what it's like. Because if I understand it and just know how to navigate it, I'm that much more able to communicate that to survivors that I walk alongside. So I was paired with an incredible attorney through ALIGHT, who helped get my record sealed here in Colorado. And it was such an empowering experience, and obviously has had such an enormous impact long-term on my life personally. But it really also kind of bolstered my confidence in ALIGHT, in understanding how it worked, what they were about. But they also, Marianna was just so open to feedback and wanting to know what was the experience like, where could they improve things, what lacked clarity. And so being able to like communicate those things and not just say them, but really have Marianna take them back to her team and say, how can we improve these things? Again, was just another indicator that ALIGHT was on the right track. So it's been an honor to partner with Marianna and ALIGHT since that time.
With today's presentation, these are the topics that we will be diving into: the findings of the Legal Deserts report, the pain points that survivors experience and the legal journey, which tends to be quite long and arduous, the current legal landscape of resources available to survivors, additional gaps in legal services. Megan will walk us through case studies that illustrate the harm of the status quo and how it's just not appropriate or sustainable for survivor empowerment, and opportunities at the end for legal professionals to help, followed by all the questions that we'll be taking at the end. And so to start with the Legal Deserts report, as we mentioned, the experience of the ground of both the Avery Center and ALIGHT, and from all the survivors we were working with, is that there are just very few legal resources available. And this was the first research of its kind that looked into the access to legal resources in practice for survivors. And we really emphasize in practice because Megan and her team looked into the 550 organizations in the US that advertise through various channels that they provide legal services through human trafficking survivors. But then this research goes into what's actually happening in practice. And so her team conducted outreach through different methods over periods of months, reaching out to every single one of those organizations on the list to actually uncover who's actually working in this area and who's actually helping survivors. This report was co-published by the Avery Center and the National Survivor Law Collective. In the spring of 2020, the height of the COVID pandemic, ALIGHT founded the National Survivor Law Collective with 2 law firms and 3 other human trafficking specific legal services providers all across the US. So we are working in and based in California, Oregon, Colorado, Florida, North Carolina, and New York. And really they're the teaser for the findings that Megan will go into is that there really are very, very few human trafficking specific legal services. And so the handful of us that were working on this wanted to combine forces to make sure that we were coordinated and raising this issue on a national level. And so this has been a very important project to partner with the Avery Center on.
Okay, so I'm going to touch on just a few of the findings, but really want to encourage you all to go check out the full report because there's so much good stuff in this report. As Marianna mentioned, my research team at the Avery Center contacted 550 organizations, and this didn't look like just sending out one email. This was group, like mass emails, individual emails, phone calls, leaving voicemails, following back up, playing phone tags. So it was very labor intensive. So really want to just speak my appreciation for our research team because this was a huge undertaking. So within that 550, 80% of those organizations we never heard a response back from after multiple attempts. So from a research perspective, a 20% response rate is fantastic. That's really what you shoot for a research project. When you put yourself in the shoes of survivors and you think about 1 out of every 5 places a survivor is contacting is even bothering to return their call or answer the phone or reply to an email, that can be really, really discouraging because even if that one place does engage in communication with you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they even are able to meet your needs, whatever those needs might be. So we had 110 that did reply and participate in our needs assessment. So of that 110, there was about 7% that didn't offer any legal services, despite their website saying they did or them being listed on some type of a directory that said that they offered legal services. 1/3 provided services related to the legal and court systems, but it was really like attending court appointments, court dates with an advocate. It wasn't necessarily legal representation. 61% of those 110 or 61 of the 110 orgs that replied actually did offer direct legal services and representation. So one of the things, this term, the legal deserts, we were really in our minds kind of envisioning maybe there's a few gaps in the country where legal services are lacking. And as you can see on the map on this slide, that basically everywhere in the United States is a legal desert. There was definitely concentrations in high density urban areas, but the rest of the United States is essentially a legal desert for survivors of human trafficking. Of those organizations that did respond, 1/3 of those organizations serve individuals who have immigration issues or who have experienced international trafficking. However, they did not provide assistance to domestic survivors, which is just another layer of legal desert. Another 1/3 of the responding organizations work in parallel movements such as domestic violence, sexual assault, or gender-based violence. And as a result, sometimes are limited in what they're able to do for trafficking survivors, or they're invisible or exclusive of male survivors of trafficking just based on where they are in the field that they work in. So all of these things kind of feel heavy and discouraging, but not everything is bad. And like I said, please go check out the full report. The orgs that really are doing this work are incredibly dedicated, they're passionate, and oftentimes they're very successful in their work when they really understand the complexities of what's needed for survivors of human trafficking. And what we also saw in doing this project was that there's a growing trend of private law firms providing pro bono assistance to survivors, and they are connected through organizations like ALIGHT to meet those needs of survivors.
Very often we see that survivors have many unmet legal needs on their journey. And these are just a few of the examples of the types of services that we work on at ALIGHT, which is just meant to illustrate that diverse expertise is really needed to come alongside survivors and support them on their journey forward. We will be going into more detail with the second workshop in the series on the specific legal needs, but with this, I really just wanted to illustrate that there's a broad range of needs. Survivors are coming from their trafficking situations. They're exiting really with their own individual circumstances and stories. And some may have gaps in their employment history. Some were forced to file fraudulent information on their tax returns, incur bad debt. Some have been fighting for child custody, especially if they share children with their trafficker. So quite an array of circumstances. And many also carry the weight of the legal consequences of the trafficking itself, where they were forced to commit crimes and then are left with the criminal records. And that is something that the Legal Deserts report also emphasizes as an issue. And so survivors often need help in one or more different areas of law, and then adding another layer of complexity to that is that they may also need help with legal needs in different jurisdictions, whether because they were moved by their trafficker across different jurisdictions, or because they may have escaped or chosen to leave one state for another to start anew, but yet the legal issues remain in different states. And so you can really see, given that there's few resources available and quite a complexity of needs, there's a big disconnect. Something that you're not seeing on this list is immigration law, which is something that ALIGHT doesn't work on specifically because immigration law tends to be the primary legal need that people think about in connection with human trafficking. And it tends to be a more resourced and addressed area of human trafficking. But just as the report pointed out, there's a huge number of survivors who are domestic survivors, and they have completely different needs and need a completely different set of resources.
Okay, so I'm going to walk you all through just 4 examples. There's hundreds more, and even just looking at these, I had such a hard time finding some that kind of summarized the complexities of these legal issues, but also communicated the breadth and depth of all the different experiences that survivors have. So Jenny is a survivor who leaves her trafficker. He is the father of her child, and the trafficker pursues custody of the child. The survivor has a history of housing instability and substance use directly related to her trafficking. And so in the courts, she has all of these barriers that her trafficker is using against her to prove that the trafficker is better suited to be the primary parent of this child. We have Terrence. So Terrence is a survivor who leaves a family of origin trafficking situation and is seeking independent housing as an adult. However, he discovers after applying for an apartment that his parents have opened multiple credit cards in his name that he is now delinquent on and show up on his credit report. Terrence has relocated across the country for safety and does not want his family of origin to know where he is currently. We have Sam. Sam is a survivor who was coerced and forced to shoplift as a part of meeting their daily quota for their trafficker, and as a result has theft charges in 9 different jurisdictions, as well as is currently facing fraud charges for stealing a customer's checkbook and cashing checks, which the cash was then taken by the trafficker. And finally, we have Amira. So following severe abuse and torture, Amira is currently unable to work and is going through the process for Social Security and disability, who has evidence of the hotel desk clerk being aware that she was being trafficked out of the weekly motel. So as I said, these are just a few examples, but as you can see, housing, employment, child custody, criminal records, civil suits, everything gets so tangled and it's so complex, and it really requires really dedicated legal representation, and the impact that is possible is just exponential when we're able to meet these legal needs.
The current landscape of legal services is especially concentrated in the first 3, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And these have been incredibly important resources that have helped countless survivors. However, our concern is that some of them have limitations that translates into survivors falling through the cracks and not being able to access these services, or not qualifying for these services, or just not even being a good fit for these services. And so legal aid certainly covers a lot of situations. However, the challenge is that there are often funding restrictions that limit what they can work on, for example, criminal defense issues. And a lot of times there's a long intake documentation process and a long waiting time, which is a very big ask for survivors, especially if they have urgent needs, especially if they're reaching out for help, not to have that sort of immediate resource to turn to. That is a barrier that they're encountering with legal aid. Law school legal clinics also work in this space. With this model, their primary goal is really the education of the students. And so some of the constraints are around the type of cases that they're able and willing to take on. And so, for example, they may be hesitant and not well equipped to take on more complex and long-term cases. From the survivor's point of view also, the survivors are coming, as I mentioned, with so many different circumstances, and some survivors are not, they are in a place where they need much more individualized support, much more experienced support. And so in those cases, the law school legal clinics may not be a good fit. Law firm pro bono departments are, as Megan mentioned, a great trend that we're seeing as these law firms are getting more involved and they have great resources that they're lending to this cause. Especially the larger law firms have multiple offices, which lets them cover multiple jurisdictions, although the practice areas of law firms, especially the larger ones, tends to be more corporate, transactional, and litigation practices, and their offices more concentrated again in urban areas. The specialization fit can become an issue, as the attorneys in large firms may not have the expertise or even practice areas devoted to things like family law, benefits, other nuts and bolts issues that survivors encounter. And an added layer to pay attention to with these types of representations is conflicts of interest, where in some cases, law firms may be conflicted out from representing human trafficking survivors if they are representing, for example, employers or hotels and airlines or other parties that may be involved in the survivor's claim. The ALIGHT model is directly a response to these gaps, where what we are creating with our program is a way to provide more comprehensive, trauma-informed, and flexible services so that we can meet as many of those diverse needs that survivors have as we can. The theme of our work is matching the survivor to the right attorney at the right time. The right attorney meaning the specific specialization that's needed, and the right time meaning leveraging the tech aspect of our model to make real-time matches and real-time notifications to attorneys of opportunities to plug in and work with survivors. We were very honored last year in February of 2020 for the American Bar Association to pass Resolution 113, where they recognized this tech-facilitated model of matching pro bono attorneys to cases in the human trafficking sphere very much needs to be promoted and advanced. And finally, the fifth model is the National Survivor Law Collective model, which I mentioned before, where the number of member organizations are coordinating and sharing resources and streamlining processes to make the on-the-ground practical experience for survivors hopefully easier and more comprehensive. Oops, there we go.
Thanks, Marianna. So as Marianna touched on, when we're thinking about gaps, what is missing right now? As we can see from the map, as you've heard from all of these examples, a lot is missing. But when we kind of look at the themes of what's needed and where we can be really pouring into this type of work and meeting these needs for survivors, the first thing is trauma-informed training. And I have personal experience working with ALIGHT, so I'm gonna, of course, talk about those great experiences with them. But this trauma-informed component is just really important. There's so many aspects. I'm just thinking through some of the experiences over the years working with clients. So we have survivors who are experiencing housing instability and are needing legal services so that they can access long-term housing, but they may not be able to communicate over phone or email for several days or even a week or two at a time, just due to that instability. And so from a lawyer needs to understand that that is potentially something that's going to happen, and it's not a signal of disinterest or disengagement in working through those legal needs, but understanding what all is at play in that survivor's life at any given moment. Another thing that we've seen very broadly, this isn't specific to legal services whatsoever, but with trafficking being a hot topic right now, folks are just really intrigued in general with how it happens, people's individual lived experiences. And so one of the things from a trauma-informed perspective that attorneys can do is remind themselves what's important to stay focused on in any given situation. There may be a lot of questions that you have when working with a survivor that are more just out of your desire to better understand trafficking at large, but don't necessarily translate into understanding the complexities of the current legal situation and how to resolve those things. So those are just a very couple limited examples, but ALIGHT does tons of training for the attorneys that are connected through their program, and that's been really incredible to work with attorneys that do get it. They offer kind of a what to expect informational to survivors, because it can be scary if you've never navigated the courts or the criminal justice system, and courts have always caused harm, or you've had negative experiences with them. It's really hard to trust that this time is going to be any different. So having information on what to expect before it happens can be really helpful for trauma survivors. The other piece is flexible eligibility requirements. And the one that I'm going to focus on the next slide, but here in a minute, because I have one more thing that I want to touch on this slide. One thing with eligibility is really looking at income and understanding how income requirements can actually exclude a lot of survivors for a lot of different reasons. Before I get to that though, I'd love to just share kind of a sneak peek of a project that the Avery Center's been working on. Last week, we were out in Houston, Texas, and this has kind of been a project that's been growing, I would say accidentally, over this last year. But it has come to the attention of the Avery Center and the Houston Mayor's Office and the Office of the Inspector General that Houston Vice has been regularly sexually assaulting people in prostitution during undercover operations, in addition to excessive force, verbal harassment, all kinds of other harms as well. And so the Mayor's Office and the OIG obviously want to put a stop to this and hold the officers that have participated in these activities, hold them accountable, and also give justice to survivors. And so our role this last week out in Houston was interviewing survivors about their experiences, explaining the formal complaint process to them, assisting with that formal complaint process, as well as offering additional services, whether it's through the Avery Center or the other organizations that are based in Houston doing incredible work. They were also on site. So there's so much that we learned last week, but I would say from a legal needs perspective, my biggest takeaway is just understanding that survivors don't necessarily know that filing formal complaints is something that we can do. We don't necessarily know the process to it, and it can feel really scary when you are speaking out about harms that were caused at the hands of somebody that has more authority than you. and not knowing what's going to happen next. So that's kind of newer on our radar in terms of legal needs, and that's not unique to Houston. When we started kind of reaching out to individuals across the United States to see who had these experiences in Houston, we had survivors from all over the country come forward with similar stories. So this is a need nationwide. And we need support with filing formal complaints and representation as those complaints move forward. But additionally, there was just so many conversations about their experiences in Houston, in Texas specifically. When it comes to prostitution, the first 2 arrests are misdemeanors. The third one becomes a felony. And so what we saw in Houston was most women end up with felonies with felony prostitution charges, which just further traps them in a cycle of exploitation. And they find difficulty exiting, finding housing, and finding employment because of those multiple felony charges on their record. So Marianna, if you can go to the next slide. So again, I'm going to just go over some examples, like I said, talking about flexibility in how survivors qualify for services, and a really tangible one to look at that we see coming up that is so frustrating to see come up is income guidelines around like pro bono legal services. And this is something that attorneys can go back to their law firms and advocate for change, and look at how do we address this. So I'm going to tell you again 3 little snapshot stories that just kind of paint different pictures of what this might look like. So Marley is currently still in prostitution, but has left her trafficker. She cannot find employment due to her criminal record, but wants to permanently exit. Her traffickers made her use her own bank accounts to purchase hotels, flights, rental cars, and post advertisements online. So she has tax returns for the years that she was actively trafficked that show her income to be well above the income requirement for pro bono legal services. So even though Marley didn't have access to that money, and the money that was there was to facilitate her trafficking, her tax returns show that she doesn't qualify for those services. Alex's trafficker had them on payroll for a legitimate company. However, they had to pay the trafficker for housing, food, and transportation once they cashed their check, leaving them essentially with nothing at the end of the week. So the survivor's proof of income, again, shows that they do not qualify for pro bono legal services. Kashmir did not self-identify as a survivor of trafficking until 11 years post-exit, but has been working to pay off $300,000 of debt incurred during the trafficking experience over the last decade. So the debt is still active on their credit report, yet they are now in a career where they no longer qualify for pro bono legal services. So again, this is just an immediate action item that you can go back to your office and your colleagues today and have a conversation around income guidelines when serving survivors, and making sure that legal services are accessible to survivors despite what's showing up on paper. Marianna, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Another immediate action item is to help us expand the network of qualified trauma-informed attorneys who are working with human trafficking survivors to fill in those legal deserts. The ALIGHT program is focused on mobilizing attorneys in various specializations so that survivors can receive assistance along not only with the different types of legal needs that they have, but also on the spectrum of representation that they require, from advocacy to counsel to court appearances. We have assisted survivors on their legal needs in 30 states and Washington, D.C., and our program is designed to be as inclusive as possible, working with survivors of all forms of trafficking, of all backgrounds, so that, again, we don't let more people fall through the cracks of different frameworks and different eligibility requirements. And this is how you start doing that work. Reach out to us through this expression of interest, through this web link. If it's possible, Steve, to drop that link into the chat for folks to be able to see that as well. And once you reach out to us, we'll be able to provide you with more information. But as mentioned, we are working with attorneys in these hot areas where survivors practically need help, from family law to criminal defense, benefits. Intellectual property is also an issue because of privacy issues and revenge porn issues that many survivors encounter, civil litigation needs, debtors' rights, employment law, and more. And the distinguishing feature about our program is because we work with survivors, because we work with attorneys across such a broad range of expertise, the attorneys are notified of pro bono opportunities that are within their wheelhouses, and they're able to assist according to their bandwidth, according to their specialization, because I know sometimes it could be intimidating for an attorney to feel like they're signing up for, they don't know what issues, they don't know for how long. And in that way, it's really ALIGHT's role to piece together the specializations that are needed at the different jurisdictions and various points of the legal journey that the survivor is going through. So there's a flexibility component to this. And attorneys are working on discrete matters. And finally, there's a community aspect where we are building a special community of attorneys that want to get involved, that recognize that this is an issue that requires special attention. Human trafficking defies so many categories. Megan and I talk about that all the time. It's just so hard to put it into the categories that are out there. It doesn't go under domestic violence. It may have some overlap. It doesn't go into homelessness, but there's so much correlation with that as well. We really need to have human trafficking specific resources, and under that, human trafficking specific legal resources. And so this is an opportunity to join our community. If you are interested in developing the legal resources in your own local community, please also reach out and we can work with you on that. But this is sort of the next step with us. And before we take questions, we just wanted to share a couple of our resources that you can again find in the handouts. The tips for attorneys working with trafficking survivors is something that Megan directly influenced, and we had many conversations around. And this is a resource, one of many, but really one of the key points that we always emphasize is that a positive professional legal experience for survivors can be part of their healing process. And so it is incredibly important to have attorneys who are keyed into trauma-informed considerations and to flipping that dynamic. The human trafficking dynamic was that the survivor was coerced, was not able to make choices, was treated as less than. And then if we can create situations where they're working with attorneys that are treating them as equals, that are listening to them, that are providing them with options and explanations, and that ends up being a very powerful step beyond the legal consequences and the legal impact. So that is the resource tips for attorneys. And we also have the Survivor Speak study, which is something that the National Survivor Law Collective put together during COVID as we reached out to 35 survivor leaders to collect their insights about legal services and particular hardships during COVID. And the responses were, some shared that they were treated as subhuman by their attorneys, while others felt they were treated with dignity and respect. That is quite the range. I mean, that is a very uneven and unfair experience with legal assistance in the US, and we would like to change that. So that's another resource to check out, and we will now move into Q&A, and we would love to take your questions. Here's our information as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Marianna and Megan, for that fantastic presentation. So we have about 7 minutes left in which we can take questions. So please type them into either the questions tab on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can put them into the chat. Either way, they will appear for me, and I will pose them to Megan and Marianna. Marianna, we did get one question, which is, does ALIGHT accept law students for internships or practicum experiences?
That's a great question. Yes, and we do have discrete projects, and it's also a great way to build that connection and provide you with that training so that you can then fully join the legal network once you've graduated. But yes, also reach out through that expression of interest, and there should be an option, law student or other, but we will follow up with everyone that's reaching out to us.
Great. I will make a couple quick announcements while we wait to see if anyone else has any additional questions. The first announcement is that when you leave the webinar screen, an evaluation will pop up. Please fill it out. It will help us to ensure that future webinars are responsive to the interests and needs of our audience. And the other announcement I will make is that part 2 of the Survivors Legal Needs webinar series is happening on November 15th at 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central. So same day of the week, same time. It's a Monday, 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central. And in part 2 of the Legal Needs Workshop series, Megan and Marianna will continue to discuss the findings of the Legal Deserts Report, namely specific areas of survivors' legal needs, gaps in the provision of appropriate legal services, and additional opportunities for legal services organizations to meet the needs of survivors. So please do tune in then. Steve, I just want to check with you. I don't see any additional questions in, oh, actually, I think I might, okay, I see an additional question. It says, you mentioned that ALIGHT doesn't work in immigration law, but are immigration attorneys still in ALIGHT's network?
Thank you for the question. We do not have immigration law attorneys in our network, specifically because we're trying to fill out everything outside of that. But many communities, and as the Legal Deserts Report finds, there do tend to be immigration pro bono programs in many, many communities.
Great, thank you. So I do not see any other questions coming in. We can give it a couple more minutes. Okay, I see another question, which is, trafficking is systemically a male-run institution. Is it necessary to show how it is patriarchal?
I'll just pop in to say I feel like I could do an entire training on patriarchy and capitalism, but I'll save that for another day.
And
yeah, that's a meaty question to handle in the remaining 3 minutes.
I'll share that it's interesting for the male attorneys that reach out who want to get involved. Some do express curiosity and concern, wondering if it's appropriate for them to work in this issue and if it could be an issue for some of the survivors to be represented by a male attorney. And we have actually never had that preference expressed by survivors, but we would work around any kind of specific needs or restrictions. But it's I always say for the male attorneys that are interested in working in this area, by default tend to be more interested in addressing these systemic issues. So it is a very meaty issue, but thank you for raising it.
Great. And then we had another question come in. Any advice for firms where lack of funding prevents providing pro bono services?
Would the attendee be able to clarify? Do they mean that the firm institutionally is not providing opportunities to do pro bono, is not supporting the individual lawyer's pro bono work? Is that what they mean?
Yeah, it sounds like because of lack of funding, opportunities for pro bono services are limited.
Yeah, there's well, with that does come into play sometimes for some firms. Of course, you know, doing internal advocacy and raising this as an interest or a program that the firm's employees care about is an important source of feedback, and always easier coming from the lawyers themselves than outside parties. But also in ALIGHT's case, we work with attorneys also as long as you are able to provide your individual malpractice insurance, and if you want to work out, if you want to and are qualified to work outside of your law firm independently, that can also be set up.
Great. And someone else asked if there are lawyers doing work on behalf of human trafficking victims in our area and they were not included in the legal deserts report, how can we get that information to you?
Megan, do you know if there's a new contact for the continued research? We were, to clarify, the 550 that were part of this study were organizations. So it was on the organizational level, legal services that were being advertised and promoted. But I think if there's additional service providers or even individual attorneys working in this area, reach out to either of us. In any case, ALIGHT would love to be in touch with you because we want to know all the resources possible out there so that we can collaborate. And perhaps we can also, as we're looking into a continuation and deeper dive, version 2 really of this report, it would be great to have that information. So I would say reach out to either of us if that's fine with you, Megan.
Yes, that's fine. I would say the same thing. I think the Legal Deserts report provides a snapshot of a moment in time. And as more people become aware of this, obviously there's going to be people that and agencies we didn't connect with just due to lack of knowing about one another. So it'd be great to do an update here in a couple years and show what resources have come since this point in time.
Great. Well, it is 1 minute past the hour, so I think that is all that we have time for. Megan and Marianna, thank you so very much. If you had additional questions, please do tune in to our next webinar in the series on November 15th, and we'll do our best to answer your questions during that webinar. Thank you all so much for joining. And we look forward to seeing you again next month. Goodbye.